The room was alive with whispers and the clinking of glasses, the laughter of the London elite echoing off the marble floors of Lady Sinclair's grand ballroom. But in the center of it all, there was one moment that stood still, hanging heavy in the air. Jasmine Hartley, plain and quiet, stood before the Duke of Ashford, her heart steady, her eyes locked on his. "Yes," she said softly, but the word rang out like a gong, clear and certain. Gideon Blackwood's smile froze. The crowd around him seemed to dissolve into the background as his gaze turned from her to the sea of witnesses, realization dawning like a heavy weight settling in his chest. He had been trapped. The words, "I accept your proposal," had escaped his lips before he'd even fully understood what was happening. But now, in the stark light of the ballroom, he could see his mistake with perfect clarity. This was no jest. This was no performance. It was real. How had it come to this? How had the sharp-tongued, arrogant Duke of Ashford been outmaneuvered by a wallflower, a woman he hadn't even noticed until just a few hours ago? His eyes flickered back to Jasmine. She stood with her head held high, a small, satisfied smile on her lips. And then the answer hit him like a hammer. 3 years. 3 years of careful planning, waiting, and watching. But how had she done it? How did a wallflower trap a duke? Let's go back 3 years. It had started as an ordinary night at Lord Pemberton's card party, where the city's finest gathered to gamble, drink, and gossip. Among them was Jasmine Hartley, a 22-year-old young woman who was often overlooked, relegated to the corners of rooms like this, her plain appearance and quiet nature making her blend into the furniture. And then there was him, Duke Gideon Blackwood, 25. With his impossibly good looks, his charm, and his cruel tongue that made others shrink back in fear. It was during the game of cards that the Duke's mocking nature would seal his fate. The conversation had turned to betting, and after a few too many glasses of wine, Gideon leaned back in his chair, eyes glinting with mischief. "I'd sooner marry that drab little mouse Hartley than lose at cards," he said, his voice loud enough for everyone to hear. His friends roared with laughter, but Jasmine, hidden behind a curtain, heard every word. She didn't flinch. She didn't react at all, but her eyes narrowed, hard as steel. She wasn't angry. She wasn't upset. She was something else entirely. She was determined. Gideon's pattern was well known among the people of London. Mock those beneath him, take pleasure in their discomfort, and never back down from a challenge. He wasn't the first to treat her like she was invisible, and he wouldn't be the last. But something in the way he spoke that night cut deeper than usual. For the first time, Jasmine's resolve hardened. That night, as the party raged on, Jasmine quietly slipped away and went home. She didn't cry. She didn't scream. She went straight to her writing desk and opened a blank journal. With a steady hand, she wrote 2 simple words at the top of the page. Project, Duke's Downfall. For the next 3 years, Jasmine studied Gideon Blackwood like a scientist studying a rare and dangerous species. She learned his habits, his routines, his weaknesses. She noted how he always played cards after a few too many drinks, how his pride made him never back down from a challenge, how he mocked those he thought were beneath him. Every social event, every ball, every gathering, Jasmine was there, observing. She took mental notes, never let him out of her sight. And all the while, she grew, not in beauty, but in confidence. She became someone people could no longer overlook, a woman who no longer hid in the shadows, but who stood her ground with quiet power, a woman who would soon have her revenge. 3 years she waited. 3 years she studied. 3 years she prepared. And tonight, at Lady Sinclair's ball, every piece would fall into place. Jasmine Hartley stood before the mirror, her fingers trembling slightly as she adjusted the lace of her gown. The delicate fabric was a shade of pale lavender that did little to enhance her plain features. But tonight, it didn't matter. Tonight, she was a woman transformed, not in appearance, but in purpose. Her lady's maid, a woman of few words, brushed through her hair with quick efficiency, casting the occasional glance at her charge, as if unsure how to approach the silence that had settled between them. "Tonight's the night, miss?" she asked tentatively, her voice soft with both curiosity and a hint of concern. Jasmine gave a small nod, her lips curving into a smile that was calm, composed, but with a sharp edge beneath it. 3 years of planning, she murmured. one night of execution. As the final touches were added to her appearance, Jasmine's thoughts drifted back over the last 3 years. 3 years had been consumed entirely by the desire for one thing: justice. Not revenge, not bitterness, but something far more satisfying: justice. For 3 years, she had studied every detail of the Duke Gideon Blackwood's life, learning his habits, his weaknesses, and his patterns. She had become a quiet shadow in the social scene, invisible to most, but always watching, always waiting. Year 1 had been spent learning the art of cards. She wasn't foolish enough to think she could outplay him in the game without preparation. So she threw herself into studying the mathematics of the game, the intricacies of probability, and the strategies that would give her an edge. It had been hard at first. So many nights spent studying tables, reading books, running calculations in her head, but she had been determined. Year 2 had brought an unexpected ally, Lady Sarah, the daughter of a distant cousin, who had proven to be more than just a pretty face at society gatherings. Sarah, ever eager for a bit of mischief, had become her co-conspirator. Together, they'd spent months practicing, playing mock games, testing Jasmine's skills, and refining her strategies. The long evenings spent in Sarah's drawing room, with nothing but cards and the quiet murmur of the fire, had been crucial. It was during that time that Jasmine had begun to realize that the real trap she was setting wasn't just about the game. It was about Gideon's pride. His pride was his greatest weakness, and it would be the key to everything. Year 3 had been the most crucial. Jasmine had spent every moment she could observing Gideon at various social events. She learned when he was most vulnerable, when his ego was inflated, and how he reacted when he was challenged. He was predictable, always quick to accept a wager, never one to back down from a game, even if he was drunk or had little chance of winning. His arrogance had made him blind to everything, and that blindness would be his undoing. And now, tonight it all came together. The plan was in motion. As she stepped into the carriage, her heart remained steady, her mind focused. She had done everything she could to ensure success. The ball was being held at Lady Sinclair's estate, an extravagant event that promised to be the social highlight of the season. It was the perfect stage for the trap. As she entered the ballroom, she could already see him, Gideon, as confident and self-assured as ever, surrounded by a group of admirers. His presence filled the room, his voice carrying over the hum of conversation. The Duke had not changed at all over the years. He was still the same Gideon Blackwood, the man who had insulted her without a second thought, the man who thought she was invisible. He made a dismissive comment about another wallflower near the edge of the room, and Jasmine's lips twitched. Perfect, she thought, exactly as I need him to be. Her eyes flickered toward Sarah, who was already making her way toward Gideon's group, effortlessly starting a conversation that would soon lead to the all-important card game. Jasmine's gaze remained fixed on Gideon as he laughed loudly at something someone had said. It was always the same. He mocked everyone who was beneath him, and in his mind, she was no different. He didn't even recognize her anymore. He hadn't since that night 3 years ago. Her heart thudded a little faster as Sarah approached him, casually mentioning Jasmine's fondness for cards. Gideon's laugh was rich and mocking as he glanced at Sarah, a challenge lighting up his eyes. "The mouse plays cards?" he said, his voice carrying across the room. How quaint. The words were like daggers to Jasmine, but she didn't flinch. She had waited too long for this moment. It was a moment when she would make him see her, not as the drab little mouse he had mocked, but as someone who could and would destroy him. She had already won the first battle. Gideon had issued the challenge. He had made the mistake of underestimating her. When Jasmine finally made her way toward the group, she took a deep breath and approached with grace, her expression calm and controlled. "Your Grace," she said, offering a slight curtsy. "It's been some time." Gideon looked at her with a blank expression, the slightest furrow appearing between his brows as he searched his memory for her identity. For a moment, she thought he might remember, but then the moment passed, and he gave a lazy smile, as though she were no more important than the chair he just sat in. "Ah," he said, finally recalling her name, though it was more of an afterthought than a revelation. "Miss Hartley." Jasmine's internal satisfaction was undeniable. He doesn't even remember me, she thought, but she didn't let it show on her face. She could almost hear the quiet laughter of her younger self in the back of her mind. All the more satisfying that he doesn't recognize the woman he once humiliated. A few minutes passed in awkward conversation, with Gideon throwing occasional glances at her as if trying to figure out why he found her so different. But the real moment arrived when Lady Sarah, ever the instigator, casually steered the conversation toward cards. She made a passing mention of Gideon's favorite pastime, and before anyone knew it, Lord Weatherby had issued a challenge. "Ashford, fancy a game of Ingen?" he asked, eyes glinting with mischief. "Why not?" Gideon answered with his typical arrogance. "I never lose." The challenge was accepted, and soon a crowd began to gather around the table. Jasmine's heart fluttered in her chest, but she kept her exterior as calm as possible. The moment had arrived. As the game began, she allowed herself to appear hesitant, almost shy. When Gideon insisted that she play, she feigned reluctance, her voice soft as she said, "Oh, I'm not skilled, Your Grace." But the bait worked. Gideon's pride flared as he scoffed. "Come now, Miss Hartley. Surely a few hands." Jasmine hesitated for only a moment before he delivered his final line, the one that would seal his fate. "Unless you're afraid of losing to me?" Jasmine's internal smile grew. "The trap is baited," she thought, as she accepted the challenge. And just like that, the game had begun, and with it, Gideon's downfall. Tonight, Jasmine Hartley would not just play cards. She would play the game of a lifetime. The cards were dealt, and the crowd settled into a tense silence, the excitement palpable. Jasmine's heart beat in time with the rhythm of the game. It was a game she had studied, calculated, and prepared for with a level of precision that could only come from years of careful observation and planning. Her hand was steady, her mind sharp as ever, and she looked across the table at Gideon, whose arrogance was barely contained beneath his confident smile. He was as sure of himself as ever, his eyes gleaming with the satisfaction of a man who believed he had already won. The first hand was a simple one. Jasmine lost deliberately. She made a show of it, letting Gideon take the victory with a smug smile, playing the part of the nervous, inexperienced card player. The crowd chuckled, enjoying the spectacle, but Jasmine's gaze never wavered. Gideon leaned back in his chair, a satisfied look on his face. "Beginner's luck running out?" he asked, his voice laced with amusement. The comment was harmless, but the way he said it was a subtle reminder that, to him, she was nothing more than a joke. Jasmine smiled modestly. Her expression one of feigned embarrassment, but inside, she was calculating the next move. The second hand came, and again, Jasmine played her part. She lost once more, allowing Gideon to feel more secure in his dominance. He laughed and teased her, enjoying the attention and the validation that came from winning, all the while unaware of the trap she was setting for him. He made a few more jokes at her expense, the crowd joining in, but Jasmine didn't react. She kept her composure, even as the sting of his words slipped under her skin. "Perhaps cards aren't for everyone, Miss Hartley," he said, louder than necessary, as if to make sure everyone heard. Jasmine laughed gently, as though the comment had no effect on her, but her eyes were colder than before. The third hand arrived, and Jasmine's strategy shifted. This time, she allowed herself to win, but only by the smallest of margins, making it appear as though it was a fluke. Her victory was subtle, almost accidental, and Gideon's expression shifted from smug satisfaction to the first flicker of doubt. He raised an eyebrow, eyeing her suspiciously. "Lucky draw, Miss Hartley," he remarked, but there was a hint of something more in his voice, a slight edge of uncertainty. Jasmine's smile was the picture of innocence. "It's all in the cards, Your Grace," she said, her voice sweet and demure, but the edge of victory was unmistakable. The crowd murmured in response, the tension building in the room as the stakes began to rise. Gideon, his pride stung, leaned back in his chair, his hand reaching for his wine glass. The game had taken an unexpected turn, and he wasn't sure how to feel about it. The cards were still in his favor, but Jasmine's calmness, her quiet confidence, made him uneasy in a way he couldn't quite explain. As the game continued, he began to show off more, boasting to the crowd, trying to regain his lost footing. "Perhaps higher stakes?" he suggested with a grin, eager to prove that he was still in control. The crowd's interest peaked at his words, and the whispers began to swell. Jasmine's eyes flickered over the gathered onlookers. She had expected this moment, expected his pride to demand more. "Oh, I couldn't possibly," she said, her tone polite but feigned modesty. Gideon's ego flared, and his eyes glinted with a challenge he could no longer resist. "I insist." "What would you like to wager?" he pressed, his smile widening as though he already knew the answer. Jasmine's gaze softened, as though she were considering the options carefully, but her mind was already made up. She had thought about this moment for months. The perfect wager that would seal his fate and force him into her trap. "If I win," she began, her voice steady, "you propose marriage to me, here, before all these witnesses." The room fell silent, as though the words hung in the air, suspended by the sheer audacity of what she had just said. For a moment, no one moved, and then laughter erupted. Gideon's friends roared with amusement, and the other guests joined in, their voices ringing with disbelief and shock. "The mouse wants a duke," one of his friends mocked, and another added, "How deliciously bold." But Jasmine didn't flinch. She remained perfectly composed, her eyes never leaving Gideon's face. He had laughed too easily at her expense, mocked her for too long, and now it was her turn. "My dear Miss Hartley," Gideon said, his voice dripping with amusement, "that's quite a wager." The laughter died down as the crowd waited for her to backpedal, to make a joke of it. But Jasmine stood her ground, her expression serious, unwavering. "You said anything I desired," she reminded him, her tone sweet but firm. The crowd shifted uneasily, some members already whispering among themselves. They had seen wagers made in jest, but this was something else entirely. This was a challenge. "And if I win?" Jasmine asked, her voice calm but steady. Gideon's eyes narrowed slightly, a flicker of realization beginning to cross his face. He was still drunk enough to think this was a game, but somewhere in the back of his mind, something was shifting. He thought of the wager 3 years ago, the one he had made in jest, but he quickly pushed it aside. His pride wouldn't let him acknowledge it. "I'll publicly admit you were right 3 years ago when you called me a drab little mouse," she continued, her voice cutting to the tension like a knife. "And I'll never attend another society function again." The word struck like a blow, and for the first time that night, Gideon faltered. His confidence, built on years of mocking others, began to crumble. His mind raced, the memory of that drunken night 3 years ago creeping back into his consciousness. He remembered the words he had said, the laughter that had followed, and the way he had dismissed her. But it didn't matter now. He wasn't going to lose to her. He couldn't. "Do we have an accord, Your Grace?" Jasmine asked, her eyes locking onto his. The room was silent. Every pair of eyes focused on him, waiting for him to make the decision. Gideon's pride flared, and with a grand gesture, he extended his hand. "Then we have an accord, Miss Hartley," he said, his voice firm, though the uncertainty beneath it was barely concealed. Jasmine's heart beat faster, but she didn't show it. She extended her hand, shaking his firmly. "Indeed we do, Your Grace." Inside, she felt the rush of victory. This was the moment. 3 years of planning, 3 years of watching, and now it was all coming together. The trap was set. The final hand began, and Jasmine's mind was focused entirely on the game. The stakes were higher than she had ever imagined. But this was no longer about cards. It was about Gideon's pride, and it was about to cost him everything. As the cards were dealt, Jasmine's thoughts were calm and measured, every calculation running through her head. Gideon had no idea what he was up against. He thought he was still the master of the game, but Jasmine had already won. She could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on her as the game continued, every second bringing her closer to the victory she had worked so hard for. She wasn't just playing for a marriage proposal. She was playing for her own dignity, for the satisfaction of watching him realize just how wrong he had been about her. The cards were more than just pieces of paper. They were the key to everything. And in that moment, Jasmine knew that this game would be the one to change everything. The final hand was about to begin, and the room held its breath. There was an electric tension in the air, as if every person present could feel the weight of what was at stake. Jasmine's hands were steady as she reached for her cards, her mind a whirlwind of calculations, probabilities, and strategies. Gideon, on the other hand, sat back in his chair with an air of casual confidence, though his eyes betrayed a flicker of doubt. He had won every hand so far, but there was something about Jasmine that unsettled him. She had the quiet, unassuming demeanor of someone who could be easily overlooked. But there was an intelligence in her eyes that suggested she was playing a much deeper game than anyone realized. The crowd's murmurs faded as the dealer began to distribute the cards, and Gideon's mind briefly wandered to the wager he had made. He still couldn't quite believe what he had agreed to, marrying Miss Hartley of all people. His friends had laughed. The crowd had found it amusing, and even had dismissed it as little more than a joke. But now, with every hand, the situation had taken a turn he hadn't anticipated. There was a certain inevitability to the way this was unfolding, and it was all he could do to maintain a facade of indifference. The first card was drawn, and Jasmine's calm smile remained unchanged. Gideon glanced at her, his gaze lingering for just a moment longer than necessary. She didn't seem nervous. She was entirely too composed. That was the first sign that he was walking into something he hadn't prepared for. The dealer's hands were swift, and soon both players had their cards in front of them. Gideon glanced at his hand, feeling a surge of confidence. It wasn't a perfect hand, but he had a solid chance. He looked up at Jasmine, but she had already turned her gaze to the cards, her face unreadable. His lips curled into a smile. This is it, he thought. I'm going to win this, and this whole ridiculous affair will be over. He gestured to the dealer. I'll stand, he said, his voice dripping with self-assurance. The room was silent, the weight of the game hanging in the balance. Jasmine's turn came, and she hesitated just long enough to make it seem like the decision was difficult. She looked at her cards again, her mind ticking through the possibilities, the odds, the strategy. She could feel the eyes of the room on her, waiting for her next move. It wasn't just about the cards anymore. It was about proving a point. She drew another card. The room seemed to exhale collectively as Jasmine's new card was revealed. It was a 4 of hearts. Jasmine's total was now 17, and she would need another card to win the game. For a split second, she could almost feel Gideon's confidence falter, just a fraction of a second before he realized what she had done. The stakes had escalated beyond the cards themselves. Jasmine had taken the risk of drawing, a move that could either make or break her. The room was silent again as Jasmine reached for the final card. She drew it slowly, deliberately, as if savoring the moment. She turned the card over. It was a 4 of hearts. The crowd gasped as Jasmine calmly placed her cards down on the table. 21, she said, her voice soft but full of finality. She didn't look at Gideon, not yet. She didn't need to. He stared at her cards, his face draining of color as he realized what had just happened. The crowd had begun to murmur, some gasping in disbelief, while others whispered excitedly. Jasmine had won. She had outplayed him, outfoxed him at his own game, and the wager was now hers. Gideon blinked, his mouth opening and closing as he processed the reality of what had just occurred. He looked from her to the cards, unable to hide the shock in his expression. The smug confidence he had worn so easily moments before was gone, replaced by something far more dangerous, a fleeting glimpse of panic. Jasmine met his eyes for the first time, her expression calm and composed. There was no triumph in her gaze, no smug smile. She had won, and now it was time to claim what was rightfully hers. I believe that's game, Your Grace, she said softly, her voice a quiet declaration of victory. Gideon's mind was racing. This couldn't be happening. He had been so sure of himself. He had dismissed her as nothing more than a mouse, a wallflower, an inconsequential player in the game of society. But now, here she was, standing before him, having won not just the cards, but the wager. His ego, his pride, everything he had built himself up to be, was on the line. And Jasmine was calm, composed, like a chess master who had just put her opponent in check. The room exploded with noise. The crowd erupted in applause and shock, as whispers of the wager and its consequences spread like wildfire. She won, someone exclaimed. The Duke must propose, another person added, and the rest of the crowd joined in, buzzing with excitement. Gideon's friends, who had been so certain of his victory, now looked at one another with uncertainty. They had all assumed this would end with a laugh, a jest, and a good story to tell. But this was no jest. This was real. Gideon's smile tightened, and for a moment he wondered if he could back out. Could he laugh it off, pretend this was all in good fun, and move on? He glanced at Jasmine, but there was no sign of hesitation in her eyes. She was serious. "Miss Hartley," Gideon said, his voice strained, "I was merely joking." The words came out too quickly, as though he was trying to convince himself more than anyone else. But Jasmine didn't flinch. She stood tall, her gaze unwavering, her voice as calm as ever. "Were you, Your Grace?" she asked, her words like daggers wrapped in silk. "How unfortunate. I am quite serious." Her statement landed in the room like a stone dropped into still water, sending ripples through the crowd. "The Duke has made me the happiest of women," Jasmine continued, her tone almost sweet, but with an edge that made it clear she was in control. The crowd was watching, hanging on every word. There were some awkward coughs, some nervous glances exchanged among Gideon's friends, but no one dared interrupt. His humiliation was becoming inevitable. Lord Pemberton, a man who had seen more than his fair share of social embarrassments, stepped forward. "Congratulations, Ashford," he said, his voice thick with irony. But it was too late. Gideon's fate had been sealed. The crowd was already shifting, some congratulating Jasmine, others turning to Gideon with sympathetic smiles. His friends, who had been so eager to laugh at Jasmine's expense, were now at a loss for words. "This is absurd," Gideon muttered, his voice low and strained, his hand gripping the edge of the table. "I was clearly joking." "Were you?" Jasmine repeated, her voice ringing with false sweetness. "How unfortunate. I am quite serious." Her words were final, and the trap had snapped shut around him. The Duke of Ashford, the most powerful man in the room, was now bound by the very words he had spoken in jest. There was no escape. He had made the wager. He had accepted the terms. And now, as the eyes of every guest turned to him, he knew that breaking his word would ruin him. In Regency society, a breach of promise was not just a social faux pas. It was a legal matter. To go back on a public proposal was grounds for a lawsuit, and that would mean a public scandal and the ruination of his reputation. His mind raced, but it was too late. He had been caught. The proposal was binding Ashford. Lord Sheffield, an older gentleman who had been watching the spectacle with a knowing smile, added, "You made it publicly, and now you must honor it." Gideon's heart sank. He was trapped, caught in the web of his own making. He could feel the weight of the room pressing down on him, the eyes of the entire society fixed on him, waiting for his next move. His pride, once so untouchable, was now his greatest enemy. Jasmine watched him with quiet satisfaction. Her revenge, years in the making, had come to fruition. She had outplayed him at every turn, and now the Duke of Ashford was the one who was trapped. She could almost taste the victory, but she didn't show it. She remained calm, poised, and dignified, as though this was nothing more than a casual evening's entertainment. Gideon, on the other hand, was a man undone. His internal panic was palpable, but he knew that was too late. There was only one option left. He could either fulfill the wager and marry Jasmine, or he could face the ruin of his reputation. The crowd, sensing the tension, began to murmur again, some with sympathetic looks for Gideon, others with amused glances at Jasmine. No one had expected this, but Jasmine Hartley had won. And as the room waited in silence, Gideon realized, with a bitter jolt, that he had just played the most disastrous and most important game of his life. Gideon's grip tightened on his glass as he tried to steady his breathing. His mind was spinning. Every word Jasmine had spoken rang in his ears, the finality of her acceptance hanging heavy in the air like a guillotine. There was no getting around it. He had lost. His arrogance, his pride, everything that had made him feel invincible, had crumbled under the weight of his own recklessness. He was trapped. This was no longer a game. This was real, and the consequences were undeniable. His heart hammered in his chest as the realization sank in. The crowd, still buzzing with excitement and disbelief, slowly began to disperse, but the weight of the moment had yet to lift. The laughter and the murmurs of the guests were like distant echoes, fading into the background as Gideon's mind raced with thoughts of how to escape this impossible situation. He had been cornered, outwitted by someone he had dismissed as inconsequential for years. Jasmine Hartley, the woman he had mocked, the woman he had ignored, had just turned his entire world upside down. And now, he had to face the consequences of his actions. He had never expected her to accept the wager, let alone to play it so masterfully. He had thought her meek, small, insignificant, easy to ridicule, easy to dismiss. And yet, here she was, standing before him with the quiet satisfaction of someone who had achieved exactly what she had set out to do. Her calm, unwavering demeanor only made the situation worse. He felt his stomach twist as he watched her stand there, the faintest trace of a smile on her lips. She wasn't triumphant. She wasn't gloating. She was simply certain, and that certainty was what terrified him. He had never been in a position where his pride, his reputation, and his very freedom hung in the balance like this. No one had ever dared to challenge him so thoroughly. No one had ever made him feel small. But Jasmine Hartley had done just that. He couldn't let this stand. He couldn't let her think she had won. Not like this. With a sense of urgency rising in him, he turned toward her, his face taut with frustration. His friends had scattered. The crowd was thinning. But Jasmine remained the center of his focus. He couldn't look away from her, not even as his mind screamed at him to find a way out. "Miss Hartley," he said, his voice strained, trying to keep his tone steady. "We need to speak. Now." Jasmine's eyes flickered to his, and for the first time since the game had begun, she allowed herself the smallest of smiles. She said nothing, only nodded in acknowledgement, and he was grateful she didn't make him wait. With as much composure as he could muster, he led her through the crowded ballroom, the sound of their footsteps mingling with the chatter and laughter that seemed so distant now. He was acutely aware of the eyes that followed them, the whispers that began to stir once they stepped into the hallway. It was as if the entire ballroom had become a stage, and every movement he made was being scrutinized. He could feel the weight of his social standing pressing down on him. Every inch of the Duke of Ashford's reputation, which he had worked so hard to build, was in jeopardy. He led Jasmine to a quieter part of the house, away from prying eyes, and the moment the door closed behind them, he turned to face her. His heart was racing, and he had to force himself to take a deep breath. The game was over, but the real battle had just begun. "What the devil do you think you're doing?" he demanded, his voice harsh with a mixture of anger and desperation. Jasmine stood before him, composed, calm, and entirely unbothered by the intensity of his reaction. Her expression was one of quiet certainty, as though she had been prepared for this moment long before he had even realized it was coming. "I'm doing exactly what you agreed to, Your Grace," she replied, her voice soft but sharp, cutting through his frustration like a blade. "I've accepted your proposal. You, of course, can choose to go back on your word, but I warn you, that comes with consequences." Her words were measured, her gaze unwavering. She wasn't afraid of him. She wasn't trying to provoke him. She was simply stating facts. And that only made the situation more unbearable for him. His jaw clenched, his fists balling at his sides. "You've made a mockery of me," he spat, his voice thick with anger. "This whole charade, you've turned it into some kind of revenge." "Revenge?" Jasmine repeated, her voice soft but carrying an edge. "This isn't about revenge, Gideon. This is about justice." The use of his first name caught him off guard, and for a brief moment, he faltered. No one had ever spoken to him like that. So calmly, so directly, without fear. It was as if he had been stripped of his title, his power, and had become just another man standing before her, vulnerable and exposed. "Justice," he echoed, his voice faltering. He shook his head, unable to comprehend the depth of her conviction. "What do you mean by that?" Jasmine's eyes softened for the briefest of moments, and for the first time he saw something other than the sharp, calculating woman he had come to know over the course of the evening. He saw someone who had been hurt, who had been disregarded and humiliated for far too long. "Do you remember Lord Pemberton's card party?" she asked, her voice quiet now, almost wistful. Gideon's face tightened. Of course, he remembered. How could he not? It had been the night he had made that cruel remark about her, about how he would rather marry her than lose at cards. His lips pressed together in a thin line. I remember, he said, his voice low, almost grudging. You were drunk, and I was an idiot. Jasmine's gaze hardened again. No, Gideon, you weren't drunk. You were cruel. You didn't even see me. I was standing behind that curtain, listening to every word you said. I heard how you mocked me, how you thought nothing of me, and I vowed that I would never again allow someone like you to disregard me. The words hit him like a physical blow. He had never considered how deeply his words had affected her. To him, it had been a careless jest, a moment of drunken bravado. But for Jasmine, it had been a turning point. He had unknowingly opened a door to a world she had never shown anyone, a world of strength, of intelligence, and of careful planning. I'm sorry, he said, the words slipping out before he could stop them. I was a fool. The apology sounded hollow in his mouth, but there was a truth to it that he couldn't deny. For the first time, he realized the full weight of his actions. Jasmine had not only planned her revenge, she had done it with precision, with intelligence, and with a focus that he had underestimated. And now, here he was, the one who had been outsmarted, the one who had been trapped. You don't need to apologize, Jasmine said, her voice cool again. You've done exactly what I needed you to do. You've shown me your true nature, and now it's time to settle the terms. Terms. Gideon repeated, his brow furrowing. What do you mean by that? Jasmine's gaze was unwavering. We have an agreement, Your Grace, and it's one that you will honor whether you like it or not. 6 months of engagement. 6 months of pretending that you care for me, that you are interested in me. 6 months of doing everything I ask of you, attending social functions, calling on me, dancing with me, showing the world that we are a proper couple. Her words were like chains wrapping around him, each one tightening with every passing moment. At the end of 6 months, she continued, I will break the engagement. I will claim that we are incompatible. You will be free, your reputation intact. But until then, you will play the part of the devoted fiancé. That is the deal. Gideon's chest tightened, his mind spinning. He could feel his world slipping away from him, piece by piece. He was trapped in a situation of his own making, bound by a wager that had escalated far beyond what he had ever intended. And if I refuse, he asked, though part of him already knew the answer. If you refuse, Jasmine said, her voice ice-cold, then I will sue for breach of promise. We have 24 witnesses to your public proposal. You will lose everything. Your fortune, your reputation, your standing in society. Your friend will turn on you. Your name will be ruined. You can't be serious, Gideon said, his voice filled with disbelief. You would destroy me over a wager? Jasmine's eyes locked onto his, and for the first time, he saw the depth of her resolve. You've already destroyed yourself, Gideon. I'm simply making sure that you understand the consequences of your actions. The silence between them was thick, heavy with the weight of what she had just said, and in that silence, Gideon realized that she had thought of everything. Every angle had been covered. There was no way out, no escape from the trap she had set. He was caught. The only thing left for him to do was accept it. 6 months, he said, his voice bitter, his pride still fighting to remain intact. 6 months of this charade? Jasmine nodded, her gaze unwavering. 6 months, Your Grace, and then you will be free. She extended her hand, and after a moment's hesitation, Gideon took it, sealing their agreement. The deal was made, and with it, his fate was sealed. As Jasmine turned to leave, Gideon couldn't help but wonder how he had allowed himself to be outmaneuvered by someone he had once deemed beneath him. The trap had snapped shut, and now, for the first time, Gideon Blackwood was truly caught. The next several weeks passed in a blur, a strange and unsettling performance that neither Jasmine nor Gideon had ever anticipated would be their lives. It was, in its essence, a charade, a carefully orchestrated show for society, for their families, for their peers. Every public appearance, every conversation, every gesture was meant to convey something they both knew wasn't real. To the outside world, they were an engaged couple destined for a grand future together. But behind closed doors, the tension between them was palpable. Jasmine had made her terms clear, and Gideon had reluctantly agreed. 6 months. 6 months of playing the role of a devoted fiancé, and then he would be free. But what neither of them had expected, what neither of them had prepared for, was how the charade would begin to shift. At first, it was easy for both of them. Jasmine, always the strategist, played her part perfectly. She smiled demurely, nodded politely, and did everything expected of her by society. She attended events with Gideon, walked beside him at the opera, sat by his side at dinner parties. She said nothing that might reveal her true feelings, always maintaining the cool, composed exterior that had become her armor. Her smile was polite but distant, never reaching her eyes. To those who watched, it was clear that the engagement was nothing more than an arrangement, one made out of obligation rather than affection. It was a game, and Jasmine was playing it for the exact reason she had set out to: justice. Gideon, meanwhile, remained the same as ever. His arrogance, his self-assuredness, never wavered. He treated Jasmine with the same cool detachment that he had always shown her, never acknowledging the true nature of the situation. He was still the Duke of Ashford, still the powerful man who had always commanded respect. But as the days passed, something in him began to shift. It wasn't dramatic at first. It was the small things. The way he noticed how Jasmine spoke with such confidence when she was engaged in conversation with other people, the way she seemed to effortlessly command a room, the way her eyes sparkled with intelligence and wit. At first, he had been dismissive of these things, simply acknowledging them as a result of her intellect. But soon, he began to see her differently. She was no longer the wallflower he had dismissed for so long. There was something about her quiet strength, her unspoken power, that drew him in, though he would never admit it to himself. It was the kind of thing that snuck up on you when you weren't paying attention, like a storm slowly building on the horizon. The more they played their parts, the more Gideon found himself intrigued and sometimes even impressed by Jasmine. There were moments, small, fleeting moments, when he saw something in her that made him stop and reconsider everything he thought he knew about her. At Lady Weatherby's garden party, for example, when a young, ambitious suitor had approached her, his intentions clearly on display for everyone to see, Jasmine had smiled politely and turned the conversation in such a way that the young man was not only flustered but left the party without so much as a second glance at her. Gideon had been watching from the corner of the room, and he couldn't help but feel a twinge of admiration. The way she handled the situation with grace and poise, something he would never have expected from the drab little mouse he had once mocked, struck him with a sharp pang of realization. This was not the woman he thought he had trapped in a game of his own making. No, Jasmine Hartley was no longer the invisible woman. She had evolved, she had changed, and somehow, without his noticing, she had become someone to be reckoned with. That realization gnawed at him as he went through the motions of their engagement. He played the part of the dutiful fiancé, attending society events, dancing with her at balls, escorting her to the opera, but with each passing day, he began to find it harder and harder to keep his distance. It wasn't just that she had outsmarted him. It was that he had begun to see her differently. She wasn't just his reluctant fiancée. She was someone he respected, someone who had earned his admiration in a way he couldn't quite explain. And that respect, he realized, was the beginning of something he had never intended. Jasmine, on the other hand, had her own battles to fight. Despite the distance she maintained with Gideon in public, despite the cool composure she showed to the world, she found herself facing a new set of emotions that she hadn't expected. She had planned this engagement as a way to teach Gideon a lesson, a way to force him to understand the consequences of his actions. But as the weeks went by, she couldn't help but notice how different he was from the man she had once written off as an arrogant, heartless fool. There were moments, just brief moments, when his guard would drop, when she would see a flicker of something more human behind the mask he wore. At the dinner party held at the Pemberton estate, when Jasmine had been cornered by Lady Cynthia and her cruel remarks, it was Gideon who had stepped in, defending her in front of the entire room. He hadn't needed to, but he had. His words had been sharp, pointed, and the way he had cut Lady Cynthia down with a few carefully chosen phrases had taken Jasmine completely by surprise. For a moment, as she watched him stand up for her, there was a brief flash of something soft in his eyes, that made her heart skip a beat. It was quickly masked by his usual bravado, but it was enough to make her wonder if, perhaps, this charade was becoming something more. It was in those moments, When Gideon's mask slipped, when his arrogance faded into something more genuine, that Jasmine began to question her own feelings. Was this truly just a game to her? Was she still motivated by the desire for revenge? Or was there something deeper beginning to stir? The more time she spent with him, the more she found herself looking at him differently. The way he moved, the way he spoke, the way he laughed. It all became a bit less irritating and a bit more endearing. But she didn't let it show. She couldn't. She had made a promise to herself, and that promise was to break the engagement after 6 months, no matter what. She had to, for her pride, for her dignity. But every time Gideon did something unexpected, something kind, something that made her heart beat a little faster, it became harder to remember why she had started this game in the first place. She had been so sure that she was in control, that she was the one who had orchestrated every move. But now, with each passing day, she wasn't so certain anymore. She wasn't sure if she was still playing the game or if the game was starting to play her. They were both caught in a web of their own making, and neither of them could figure out how to get out. But neither of them was willing to admit it. The engagement continued, the charade going on as planned, but the shift was undeniable. Neither Jasmine nor Gideon could ignore the growing tension between them, the strange undercurrent of something that neither had intended, but that neither could deny. They had started this as adversaries, but now, in the quiet moments between the public displays of affection and the forced smiles, they were starting to wonder if perhaps the trap they had set for each other had ensnared them both. And somewhere deep inside, beneath all the layers of pride and strategy, neither of them was sure anymore whether they wanted to escape it. The charade was becoming something else entirely. The lines between performance and reality were blurring, and neither of them knew how much longer they could keep pretending. 3 months into the engagement, the situation had become far more complicated than either Jasmine or Gideon had anticipated. What had started as a calculated performance, one designed to teach the Duke of Ashford a lesson in humility, had slowly, almost imperceptibly, shifted into something neither of them was prepared for. For Jasmine, the fine line between revenge and genuine affection was starting to blur. She had meticulously planned this engagement to last for 6 months, but with each passing day, the lines between playing her role and feeling something more began to confuse her. She had started the charade as a way to exact justice, to reclaim her dignity, and perhaps to get back at the man who had once mocked her so cruelly. But somewhere along the way, she found herself questioning her own motives. Gideon, for all his faults, was not the man she had imagined. Yes, he was still arrogant, still prideful, but he was also more than that. There was something raw beneath the surface, something vulnerable that he rarely let anyone see. Jasmine had noticed the small, almost imperceptible shifts in his behavior. When he started to pay attention to the little things she said, when he began to compliment her talents, and when he defended her from cruel remarks made by others. He wasn't the callous Duke she had once believed him to be. He was, in fact, a man of layers, layers that Jasmine had begun to peel back, each one revealing more complexity, more humanity than she had ever expected. But that was the problem. The more she got to know him, the more she realized that the person she was falling for wasn't just the Duke of Ashford, the man who had once insulted her, but the man beneath that armor, the one who was far less certain of himself than he let on. And as much as Jasmine hated to admit it, she was starting to care for him. It terrified her. She had vowed to break the engagement in 6 months, to release him from the bargain and walk away without a second thought. But each day made it harder to keep that promise. The worst part was that she could see the same shift in Gideon. His arrogance, which had once been his armor, had begun to crack. It was subtle, but Jasmine noticed it. How he began to seek her out at social events. How he took every opportunity to sit beside her, talk to her, and make her laugh. He was no longer just the Duke of Ashford, the unapproachable aristocrat who had once ridiculed her. He was someone she was starting to admire, someone who, despite his flaws, was showing her sides of himself that no one else saw. There was a tenderness in the way he looked at her when he thought no one else was watching, and it made her stomach flip in ways she couldn't explain. It wasn't love, not yet, but it was something far deeper than she had intended. The shift was undeniable. It was as though they were slowly slipping from the roles they had been playing into something that felt real, something that made Jasmine's heart race and her thoughts scatter in all directions. For a moment, she had allowed herself to believe that perhaps she was wrong, that maybe this was not just about vengeance or punishment. Maybe there was something else between them, something she had never considered. But just as quickly as that thought surfaced, she shoved it back down, telling herself it didn't matter. She couldn't afford to get lost in this illusion. She had a plan, and she couldn't allow herself to deviate from it. No matter how much Gideon's presence began to stir emotions she had spent years suppressing. As for Gideon, he too was caught in a spiral of confusion. He had never expected this engagement to change him. He had agreed to the terms with the assumption that it would be a fleeting inconvenience, something he would endure for a few months and then escape, free from the grasp of the woman who had outwitted him. But somewhere along the way, something had shifted. The more time he spent with Jasmine, the more he realized that she wasn't just a quiet, invisible woman he had once mocked. She was sharp, intelligent, and completely in control of the situation. He had never been good with women who weren't enamored with him, but Jasmine wasn't like that. She didn't seek his approval. She didn't crave his attention. And that only made her more intriguing. There were moments when he would catch her in a quiet, introspective moment, her gaze distant, her expression thoughtful, and it made him ache with an emotion he couldn't quite place. He began to find himself drawn to her in ways he hadn't expected. She wasn't just a challenge anymore. She was someone he admired. He began to look forward to moments when they were alone together, when the pretense of their engagement could fall away, and he could speak to her without the weight of society's expectations looming over them. But there was a conflict in him, one that gnawed at his gut. He had been so certain, so confident in his own superiority, and now he was beginning to wonder if he had misjudged everything. Was he in love with her, or was he simply drawn to the challenge she presented? He couldn't even answer that question, and that uncertainty made him uneasy. The crisis came one afternoon at the Covington ball, when everything came to a head. Jasmine and Gideon had been the center of attention all evening, as was customary for an engaged couple of their status, but there was an undercurrent of tension between them that no one else seemed to notice. The music played, the guests danced, and the conversation swirled around them, but neither of them was fully present. Jasmine was distantly aware of how Gideon's hand lingered a little too long on her waist as they danced, how his gaze seemed to linger on her lips when he spoke, how he was no longer just playing the role of a fiancé, but slowly becoming more genuine. The realization hit Jasmine like a thunderclap. This wasn't just a charade anymore. He wasn't just going through the motions to escape. He was changing. She could see it in his eyes, in the way his words were becoming softer, more sincere. He wasn't pretending anymore, and that terrified her. The dance ended, and they stood together at the edge of the room, watching the couples twirl across the floor. Jasmine felt a weight settle in her chest. She couldn't keep this up any longer. She couldn't continue pretending that she wasn't starting to feel something for him, something she couldn't name. She had promised herself that she would break the engagement in 6 months, but now that the time was drawing near, the thought of walking away from him was more painful than she could have imagined. She had never expected to find herself in this position, to have feelings for the man who had once been her tormentor. But there was no denying it now. She had fallen for him, and in the process, she had lost control of the very game she had set in motion. Gideon, too, felt the weight of the moment. He could see the shift in Jasmine. He could feel in the way she withdrew from him, the way her smile no longer reached her eyes. He knew she was starting to pull away, and it was killing him. He had never been one to care much for anyone other than himself, but somehow Jasmine had worked her way under his skin. And now, as the time to break the engagement approached, he realized that he couldn't let her go. He was in love with her. The realization was like a punch to the gut. How had it happened? When had he allowed himself to fall for the woman who had once been so invisible to him? When had he stopped seeing her as a challenge and started seeing her as someone he couldn't imagine his life without? The crisis came to a head when they were alone in the garden, just outside the ballroom, away from the noise and the eyes of society. The cool night air wrapped around them, but it did little to cool the heat that had suddenly flared between them. Gideon turned to Jasmine, his voice low and urgent. "Jasmine," he said, his voice raw with emotion, "I can't do this anymore." She looked at him, her heart racing. "What do you mean?" she asked, her voice trembling despite her best efforts to remain composed. "I'm in love with you," he said, the words tumbling out in a rush. "I know it's insane, and I know I shouldn't feel this way, but I do. I love you, Jasmine. I've loved you for weeks now, and I can't let you go. Not like this." Jasmine stood there, frozen, her heart pounding in her chest. She had known this moment was coming, but she hadn't been prepared for it. She had spent the last 3 months trying to ignore the way he made her feel, the way his presence had begun to mean more to her than she had ever intended. And now, hearing him say the words aloud, it was as though everything she had worked for, the careful wall she had built, was beginning to crumble. She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came. Instead, she turned away, needing space, needing to think. She couldn't keep doing this. She couldn't let herself fall in love with him. But as she walked away, the weight of the decision settled on her shoulders, and she realized with a sinking heart that there was no easy way out. The game they had started had spiraled far beyond their control, and neither of them knew how to stop it now. They were both trapped by their feelings, by their promises, and by the love they had never intended to find. The weeks following that fateful night in the garden were a whirlwind of emotions neither Jasmine nor Gideon had been prepared for. The words Gideon had confessed to her, words that had come from a place of raw vulnerability, had echoed in her mind over and over. "I'm in love with you." The truth of them had shaken her to her core. How had it happened? How had she, the woman who had planned this entire engagement as a scheme for justice, found herself standing on the precipice of something far deeper? She had spent so much time convincing herself that she was in control, that she was only seeking revenge for the mockery and humiliation of 3 years ago. Yet, in the silence of that night, when Gideon's confession had hung in the air between them, she realized something had changed. She had fallen for him. The realization was like an avalanche, overwhelming and undeniable. At first, she had tried to push the feeling away, retreating into the walls she had built for herself, the same walls that had protected her from the pain of being overlooked and mocked all her life. But with each passing day, she found herself drawn to him, not just as the Duke of Ashford, but as the man he had become in her eyes. She had spent 3 years studying him, learning his weaknesses and his strengths. But what had always eluded her was the man beneath the arrogance, beneath the coldness. She saw now that Gideon was not just a ruthless duke who had mocked her at Lord Pemberton's card party. He was a man struggling with his own insecurities, with his own fears, and with the same vulnerability that she had long hidden from the world, and that terrified her. She had spent so long building herself up to be someone who would never need anyone, someone who would never fall prey to the very pride and arrogance she had once despised. Yet here she was, unable to deny the fact that her heart had betrayed her. Gideon, too, had been living in a haze of confusion and longing since that night. His feelings for Jasmine had grown in a way he had never expected. At first, he had tried to chalk it up to the thrill of the challenge, the way she had played him at his own game, the way she had outsmarted him in front of everyone. But as the days turned into weeks and the charade continued, he realized that it wasn't just about winning anymore. It wasn't about the wager or the proposal. It was about her. Jasmine had become more than just a woman he had once mocked. She had become his confidant, his equal, and in a way he could not fully articulate, she had become his obsession. The way she moved, the way she spoke, the way her laugh made him feel lighter in a world he had long thought he could control, all captivated him. He was drawn to her intelligence, her quiet strength, and the way she seemed to hold the world at arm's length, refusing to let anyone see the depths of who she truly was. For so long, he had lived in a world where everyone sought to please him, where everyone catered to his whims and desires. But Jasmine was different. She didn't need him, didn't want him in a way he had always been used to, and that made him want her more. The shift had come so subtly that it took him by surprise. The man who had once been so certain of his own invincibility was now unsure of everything, questioning his every move. Was he in love with her? The thought had taken root deep in his heart, and by the time the 6-month mark was approaching, Gideon knew the answer. He was in love with Jasmine Hartley, and he couldn't let her go. The problem was, she was still playing the game, still keeping her distance, still holding on to the promise she had made to herself, to her plan. She had made it clear from the beginning that once the 6 months were up, she would end the engagement, and he would be free. But Gideon had no intention of letting that happen. The time for games was over. He couldn't go back to the man he had been, the man who had mocked her and dismissed her, not after everything they had shared. He had never been good with words, but this was different. For once, he didn't want to hide behind his arrogance. He wanted to be honest. He wanted to fight for what he had come to realize was the most important thing in his life, Jasmine. And so, as the day of their engagement's end drew nearer, Gideon knew what he had to do. He would do it the only way he knew how, with honesty, with sincerity, and with a love that was as real as anything he had ever felt. He had already made his decision. He couldn't lose her. As they arrived at Lady Sinclair's ball, the final event of their engagement, the weight of the moment settled heavily on both their shoulders. The glittering chandeliers overhead, the sounds of laughter and music, all seemed distant to Jasmine. Her mind was a whirlwind, torn between the duty she had bound herself to and the truth she had come to accept. Gideon, for his part, had never looked more handsome. His usual arrogant mask replaced with something more genuine, more vulnerable. She could see it in his eyes, the way they followed her as she entered the ballroom, the way his gaze softened whenever they made eye contact. It wasn't a performance anymore, and neither of them knew what to do with that. The night was a blur of conversations, forced smiles, and polite nods. Jasmine played her part with grace, but in the back of her mind, she was counting the minutes until the 6 months were over, until the contract was fulfilled, and she could walk away from the charade. But Gideon had other plans. He had been watching her all night, his mind a whirlwind of thoughts and emotions. He couldn't let her go. Not like this. He needed to make her see that this wasn't just a game anymore. He had to convince her that what they had wasn't just some fleeting attraction, but something real. As the clock struck midnight, he found her standing alone on the terrace, her gaze distant as she stared out at the moonlit garden. He approached her slowly, his heart pounding in his chest. He had no script, no rehearsed words. This wasn't performance. It was a plea. "Jasmine," he said softly, his voice steady despite the storm raging inside him. She turned to face him, her expression unreadable. "What is it, Gideon?" she asked, her tone polite but distant. He could hear the walls in her voice, the distance she had placed between them, and it hurt more than he had expected. "I need to say something," he said, taking a step closer. "Something I should have said a long time ago." Jasmine's gaze shifted to the ground, her hands clasped in front of her. "You don't need to say anything," she said quietly. "The engagement ends tonight, as we agreed. You'll be free." "No," Gideon said, his voice firm, but his hands shaking slightly. "I won't be free. Not unless you're with me. I love you, Jasmine. I've loved you for months now, and I can't let you walk away from me. I can't let you go, not without telling you the truth." Jasmine's breath caught in her throat, her heart hammering in her chest. She hadn't expected this. She hadn't prepared herself for him to say those words. She opened her mouth to respond, but no words came. Instead, she stood there frozen as Gideon stepped forward, his hands reaching for hers. "You've made me see things differently. You've made me want to be a better man. Jasmine, I don't want to lose you. I want you to be my wife. Not because of a wager, not because of a promise I made 3 years ago, but because I love you, and I need you in my life. Please." The sincerity in his voice, the rawness of his confession, took Jasmine's breath away. She had spent so long trying to protect herself, trying to maintain control, but in that moment, she realized something. She didn't need to protect herself from Gideon. She didn't need to hold on to the walls she had built. He had broken them down without even trying, simply by being honest. "Gideon," she whispered, her voice breaking. "I'm scared. I've spent so long planning, so long making sure I never let anyone in. I never thought I would be here, with you, wanting something more than I had intended." "I understand," he said gently, "but we can't keep pretending, Jasmine. Not anymore. Please. I love you. Will you marry me?" His words hung in the air, and for a moment, Jasmine was silent, her heart pounding in her chest. But then, with a shaky breath, she looked up at him, her eyes filled with emotion. Yes, she whispered, her voice barely audible. Yes, I'll marry you. And in that moment, everything changed. The charade was over. The wager was forgotten. And as Gideon pulled her into his arms and kissed her, everything they'd been fighting for, everything they'd been afraid to admit, was finally laid bare. They had both been caught in the trap they had set for each other. But it wasn't a trap of revenge or manipulation. It was a trap of love. A love neither had expected, but one that was real and undeniable. And as they stood there, their lips still touching, their hearts beating in time with one another, they both knew that the greatest victory of all was not winning a game, but finding someone who could see them for who they truly were. It was the beginning of a new chapter, one where they would no longer play games, but live their lives together, forever,